the world was not silent. It was a constant, violent vibration. To Ada, the rain didn't hiss or drum it pummeled. She felt every drop that struck her thin, sodden shift like a dull needle, a relentless tapping against her freezing skin. The mud beneath her bare feet wasn't a squelching sound. It was a sucking, cold mouth that tried to swallow her whole with every shift of her weight. She stood on the rough-hewn planks of the auction block, her hands bound before her with rough hemp rope that bit into her wrists, chafing the skin raw. It was a gray day in Blackwater Ridge, the kind where the sky hung low and heavy like a bruised eyelid. The air tasted of wood smoke, wet dog, and the acrid biting scent of cheap tobacco. Ada couldn't hear the jeers of the men gathered in the muck below, but she could see them. She saw the way their mouths twisted into jagged shapes, revealing yellow teeth. She saw the spittle flying from their lips as they shouted, their faces contorted with a cruelty that didn't need sound to be understood. She was 19 years old. She had been the property of the terrifying gin-soaked man named Jebediah Crouch since the fever took her parents and her hearing 5 years ago. He ran the trading post like a fiefdom, and she was his mule. She chopped wood until her hands bled. He hauled water until her back spasmed. And now, because she had dropped a crate of expensive whiskey when a sudden vibration startled her, she was broken stock. Crouch paced around her on the platform. He was a small, twitchy man with a face like a dried apple and eyes that swam in a perpetual haze of alcohol. He wore a stained frock coat that smelled of mildew. Ada knew the smell well. She had tried to scrub it out 100 times. He grabbed her chin, his fingers digging into her jaw, and forced her to look at the crowd. He was shouting. She could feel the reverberation of his voice in the wood of the platform beneath her feet. He gestured wildly, pointing to her ears, then to her head, making circling motions with his finger. Crazy, broken, empty. He stepped behind her. Ada went rigid, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She hated it when he was behind her. She couldn't read his intent. Suddenly, a shockwave hit the air near her left ear. Ada flinched violently, stumbling forward, nearly falling off the block. The crowd erupted. She saw them throwing their heads back, their bodies shaking with laughter. Crouch hopped around in front of her, grinning, bringing his hands together in a mocking applause. He had clapped right next to her head. He was showing them she couldn't hear, that she was easily spooked, a creature of instinct and fear. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of cardboard on a string. He hung it roughly around her neck. She looked down. In crude charcoal letters, it read defective, $1. Tears, hot and stinging, welled in her eyes, blurring the sea of muddy coats and cruel faces. She wasn't a person here. She was less than a dog. A dog could bark. A dog could hear a command. She was just a body that took up space and ate food. The shame was a physical weight, heavier than the rain-soaked wool of her dress. She fixed her gaze on the horizon, on the jagged, mist-shrouded peaks of the Iron-Tooth Mountains, wishing she could dissolve into the gray fog. If you are liking this story, please subscribe. I know you must have subscribed by now, so let's continue. The vibration in the platform changed. It wasn't the erratic, skittering tremor of Crouch's boots. It was a rhythmic, deep thrumming that traveled up through the soles of her feet and settled in her bones. Thud, 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 heavy, deliberate, massive. The crowd's movement changed too. The laughter died on their lips. The men in the front row stumbled back, tripping over each other in the mud to clear a path. Faces that had been twisted in mockery went slack with fear. Ada wiped her eyes and looked toward the tree line. A shadow had detached itself from the forest. He rode a horse that looked like a war machine, a massive black destrier with hooves the size of dinner plates. The beast breathed steam into the cold air, but it was the rider who sucked the oxygen from the square. He was a giant. He wore a coat made of wolf pelts, the gray fur matted with rain and snow, making him look like a piece of the mountain come to life. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but Ada could see the glint of eyes that were the color of slate, cold, hard, and unreadable. A scar, white and jagged, ran from his temple, cutting through his eyebrow and disappearing into a thick, dark beard. Elias Thorne, the ghost of the Iron Tooth. Ada had heard the stories before she lost her hearing. They said he ate raw meat. They said he had killed a bear with his bare hands. They said he spoke to no one. He rode straight to the auction block. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. No one dared to meet his gaze. Even the rain seemed to shy away from him. He stopped the horse. The beast snorted, tossing its head, the vibration rattling in Ada's chest. Crouch stopped his capering. He looked small and withered next to the mountain man. He licked his lips, his hands trembling. He said something. Ada saw his lips move fast, nervous, placating. He pointed at the sign around her neck. Defective. Elias didn't look at Crouch. He looked at Ada. His gaze felt like a physical touch. It wasn't lecherous like the miner's. It wasn't cruel like Crouch's. It was an assessment. He looked at her bound hands. He looked at the bruises on her arms. He looked at the sign. His expression didn't change. It was a mask of stone. He reached into his coat. The movement was slow, deliberate. The crowd held its collective breath. Was he going for a gun? A knife? He pulled out a coin. It glinted silver in the dull light. He flipped it. It spun through the rain, a flashing arc of silver, and landed with a wet slap in the mud right at Crouch's feet. A single silver dollar. Crouch stared at it. He looked up at Elias, his face twisting into a sneer of greed masking his fear. He opened his mouth to haggle, to say she was worth at least 2 maybe for the breeding. Elias shifted in his saddle. The leather creaked. He placed his hand on the hilt of a massive bowie knife strapped to his thigh. He didn't draw it. He just rested his hand there. Crouch snapped his mouth shut. He scrambled in the mud, snatched up the dollar, and bit it to check its authenticity. He nodded frantically, waving his hand at Ada. "Take her! Get out!" But Crouch couldn't resist one last cruelty. He pulled a pair of rusty shears from his pocket. He grabbed a handful of Ada's long, rain-soaked hair. He grinned at the crowd, pantomiming that he would take a souvenir before the goods were delivered. Ada screamed a silent choke sound and tried to pull away, but he yanked her head back. The vibration of the platform shattered. Elias moved faster than a man of his size should be able to move. He didn't dismount. He leaned down from the saddle, his arms shooting out like a striking cobra. His hand massive, gloved in rough leather, closed around Crouch's wrist. Ada felt the snap through the soles of her feet. Crouch's mouth opened in a silent scream. The shears fell into the mud. Elias twisted the man's arm, forcing him to his knees in the slush. Elias leaned down further. His face was inches from Crouch's terrified, weeping eyes. He spoke then. Ada couldn't hear it, but she saw the shape of the words. They were slow, precise, terrifying. "Touch her again and I take the hand." He released Crouch, who fell back into the filth, cradling his broken wrist. Elias turned to Ada. The violence drained from his posture, replaced by a rigid, awkward tension. He extended his arm. Ada hesitated. She looked at the giant, then at the weeping man in the mud. She looked at the crowd, who watched with bated breath. She reached out. Elias grabbed her waist. His grip was iron hard, but he didn't bruise her. He lifted her effortlessly, swinging her up onto the saddle in front of him. She landed against his chest. He smelled of pine resin, wet fur, and old blood. He was a wall of heat against the freezing rain. He reached around her to grab the reins, effectively caging her in his arms. He didn't look at her. He kicked the horse. The beast surged forward. They left the trading post, left the mud and the laughing men, and began the climb toward the jagged peaks that pierced the sky. Ada clung to the horse's mane, unable to hear the wind howling around them, feeling only the thunderous heartbeat of the horse and the terrifying silent strength of the man who had bought her for $1. The ascent was a slow, brutal climb into the throat of the sky. The rain that had turned Blackwater Ridge into a sewer transformed, mile by agonizing mile, into sleet, and then into hard driving snow that stung Ada's face like blown sand. She sat rigid within the circle of Elias Thorne's arms, terrified to move, terrified to lean back against the wall of wolf fur and muscle that caged her in. The heat radiating from him was the only thing keeping her blood moving, a furnace burning against her frozen spine. She couldn't hear the wind howling through the canyons, but she could see its violence. She saw the ancient pines bowing and snapping under the invisible weight. She saw the mane of the great black horse whipping back into her face, stinging her eyes. She felt the horse stumble once on loose shale, the sudden lurch sending a jolt of pure panic through her chest. But the man behind her didn't flinch. His arm tightened around her waist, an iron band that promised she wouldn't fall, even if the world did. They climbed until the air grew thin and tasted of ozone and ice. The gray mist of the valley below was gone, replaced by the stark, blinding white of the high peaks. Finally, the horse crested a ridge that seemed to jut out over the edge of the world. The vibration of the beast's gait changed, from the struggle of the climb to a steady, heavy plod. Ada wiped the frozen slush from her eyelashes and looked up. There, crouched against the sheer granite face of the Iron Tooth, was the cabin. It wasn't a house, it was a fortress, half built of logs the diameter of whiskey barrels, darkened by age and creosote, and half hewn directly into the living rock of a cave mouth. It looked as if the mountain was slowly swallowing the structure, or perhaps birthing it. There were no windows on the windward side, only a low, heavy door reinforced with iron straps. Smoke whipped from the stone chimney, flattened instantly by the gale. Elias halted the horse. The vibration ceased, leaving Ada in a sudden, dizzying stillness. He swung his leg over the saddle and dropped into the snow. The impact shuddered through the horse's flank. He didn't seem to notice the knee-deep drift. He reached up. Ada hesitated. Her legs were numb, useless blocks of ice. Her hands, still bound, were blue. Elias didn't wait. He reached up, his massive hands spanning her waist. He didn't struggle. He didn't grunt. He pulled her from the saddle and held her suspended for a moment, looking at her with those slate-gray eyes that seemed to strip away her defenses. Then, he lowered her into the snow. She sank to her knees instantly, her frozen legs refusing to hold her. Elias caught her by the scruff of her dress, hauling her upright like a sack of grain. He didn't speak. He simply turned and marched toward the cabin, dragging her along in his wake, his boots punching deep holes in the snow. He kicked the door, sharp vibration through the floorboards, and shoved it open. He pulled her over the threshold and kicked the door shut behind them, dropping a heavy wooden bar into place. The sudden cessation of the wind's visual fury was jarring. The cabin was dim, lit only by the dying embers of a fire in a massive stone hearth. It smelled of wood smoke, cured leather, and something muskier, the scent of a solitary animal's den. Elias released her. Ada stumbled back against the rough log wall, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. It was a single large room that extended back into the cave. The walls were rough rock, slick with condensation. A bed in the corner was piled high with buffalo robes. A table sat in the center, cluttered with skinning knives, ammunition, traps, and dirty tin plates. It was a chaotic mess of steel and grease. Elias walked to the hearth. He grabbed a poker and stabbed at the logs, sending sparks flying up the chimney. He threw a fresh log on, the fire roaring back to life, casting long, dancing shadows against the rock walls. He turned to her. He pulled a knife from his belt. Ada gasped, pressing herself flat against the logs, squeezing her eyes shut. "This is it," she thought. "This is where he cuts me." She felt a tug on her wrists. The pressure of the rope vanished. She opened her eyes. The cut rope lay on the floor. Elias was sheathing the knife. He pointed to the fire. Then he pointed to a stool. He gestured to his mouth, then to the larder. Ada stood frozen. She didn't understand. Was he asking if she was hungry? Was he telling her to cook? His beard hid his lips, making it impossible to read them. Elias frowned. The scar on his face pulled tight. He pointed again, more aggressively, at the larder. He made a motion of eating. Ada stared at him, her hands trembling. She rubbed her chafed wrists, her mind racing. "I don't know what you want. Please don't hit me." Elias let out a breath that puffed in the cold air. He stomped over to the table. He grabbed a tin cup. He slammed it down on the wood. Thud. Ada felt the vibration travel through the floorboards and upper legs. She saw the dust jump on the table surface. But she didn't flinch. She didn't blink. Her eyes remained locked on his face, wide and terrified. Elias paused. He looked at the cup. He looked at her. A normal person would have jumped at the noise. A normal person would have flinched. He stepped closer. He towered over her, a mountain of fur and shadow. He raised his hands. Clap! He brought his massive palms together right in front of her face. The air pressure hit her skin, causing her to blink, but there was no startled response to the sound. Elias lowered his hands. His expression shifted. The irritation vanished, replaced by a strange, dawning comprehension. He looked at the defective sign still hanging around her neck. He reached out. Ada flinched this time, expecting a blow. He didn't strike. He grabbed the cardboard sign and ripped it from her neck, snapping the string. He crumpled it in his fist and tossed it into the fire. It flared up, burning bright for a second before turning to ash. He looked at her again. He tapped his own ear, then shook his head. Ada nodded slowly. Yes, silence. Elias grunted. He turned away, seemingly dismissing her existence. He grabbed a heavy canvas sack and his rifle. He walked to the door, unbarred it, and stepped back out into the storm, slamming it shut behind him. Ada was alone. The silence of the cabin pressed in on her. It wasn't the fearful silence of the auction block. It was a heavy, ancient silence. She looked around. The cabin was a disaster. Not filthy exactly, but neglected. A layer of dust coated the shelves. The floor was unswept, littered with pine needles and dried mud. The table was a graveyard of half-finished projects. She looked at the fire. It was the only friend she had here. She looked at the table. Among the clutter lay a set of skinning knives. They were dull, the edges nicked and abused. A whetstone lay nearby, dry and unused. Ada moved. She found a bucket of water near the door, frozen over. She broke the ice with a ladle and scooped out a bowlful. She drank greedily, the cold water shocking her empty stomach. Then she found a rag. She went to the table. She picked up the largest knife. It was a beautiful piece of steel, bone-handled, but neglected. It was heavy in her hand. I am not a pet, she thought fiercely. I am not broken stock. I am useful. She sat on the stool. She wet the stone. She began to work. She couldn't hear the rasp of steel on stone, but she could feel it. She felt the grit biting into the metal. She felt the vibration in her fingertips, a steady, rhythmic language she understood better than speech. Push, slide, turn, push, slide, turn. She worked the edge. She worked until the vibration changed from a rough grating to a smooth, singing hum that she felt in her wrist. She wiped the blade clean. She tested it against the leather of her shoe. It sliced through the tough material like it was water. She moved to the next knife, then the next. She organized the table. She stacked the ammunition boxes. She hung the traps on the pegs by the door. She found a broom made of twigs and swept the floor. The rhythmic swish-swish of vibration she felt in her toes. She found a piece of dried venison in the larder and cut it into strips with a newly sharpened knife. She put them in a pot with water and hung it over the fire. Hours passed. The light in the room shifted as the day died outside. The vibration of heavy boots returned to the floorboards. The door opened. A gust of snow blew in, swirling across the clean floor. Elias stepped inside, carrying 2 skinned rabbits. He stopped. He looked at the floor. Clean. He looked at the table. Orderly. He smelled the broth bubbling on the fire. He walked to the table. He put the rabbits down. He picked up his skinning knife. He ran his thumb lightly over the edge. A drop of blood welled up instantly, dark and round. He looked at the knife. Then he looked at Ada. She was standing by the hearth, twisting her apron in her hands, waiting for his judgment, waiting to be told she had done it wrong, waiting to be hit. Elias wiped his thumb on his trousers. He looked at the knife again, turning it in the firelight. It was sharper than it had been the day he bought it. He looked at her. He didn't smile. She wasn't sure he knew how, but the tension in his shoulders dropped an inch. He nodded, a single sharp dip of his chin. Good. He pulled out the stool and sat, gesturing for her to sit opposite him. He cut a piece of the rabbit meat with a knife, the blade parting the flesh effortlessly, and pushed it toward her. It was a silent truce, a recognition. She wasn't just a mouth to feed. She was a pair of hands, and in the high mountains, hands were the difference between life and death. Gemini said. The snow didn't stop. It piled against the cabin walls in drifts that reached the eaves, sealing them in a tomb of white silence. For 3 weeks, the world outside ceased to exist. There was only the fire, the smell of curing leather, and the man who moved like a landslide through the small space. Elias had been coughing for days. At first, it was just a subtle vibration in the floorboards when he sat by the hearth, a rhythmic thumping that Ada felt through her soles. He ignored it, of course. He was a creature of iron and gristle, accustomed to ignoring pain. He continued to check the trap lines in the blinding whiteout, returning with his beard crusted in ice and his breath rattling in his chest like loose gravel in a tin can. But the mountain demanded a toll for every defiance. It happened on a Tuesday, or perhaps a Wednesday. Time had lost its shape in the perpetual twilight of the storm. Elias was mending a snowshoe, his large hands working the raw hide with a clumsy, feverish slowness. Ada was across the room, carving a spoon from a piece of birch. She felt the thud before she saw it. It was a heavy, dull impact that shook the heavy timber table. Ada dropped the spoon and spun around. Elias was on his knees. The snowshoe lay forgotten on the floor. He was gripping the edge of the table with white-knuckled force, his head hanging low. His shoulders heaved with a violence that terrified her. She rushed to him. She reached out, hesitating for a fraction of a second. Old instincts of fear still lingered before placing her hand on his back. The heat coming off him burned her palm through his flannel shirt. It wasn't just a fever. It was a conflagration. He looked up at her. His eyes, usually so sharp and gray, were glassy and unfocused, swimming in a haze of delirium. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out, or if it did, it was lost to her silence. All she saw was the desperate, gasping motion of his lips, the cords of his neck straining as he fought for air that wouldn't enter his lungs. He tried to stand, to push her away, to retreat to his furs and ride it out alone as he had done for a decade, but his legs folded. He collapsed. He hit the floor with a bone-jarring crash. Ada didn't scream. Screaming was useless in her world. Instead, she moved. He was heavy dead weight. She couldn't lift him to the bed, so she brought the bed to him. She dragged the buffalo robes, the heavy wool blankets, and the pillows to the hearth. She rolled him onto the pallet, gritting her teeth against the strain in her back. He was shivering now, violent, bone-rattling rigors that made his teeth clack together. Ada felt the tremors vibrating through the floor, a constant, terrifying reminder of his fragility. "Lung fever," she whispered to the empty room, the shape of the words familiar from the time her father died. She went to work. She built the fire up until the heat was stifling. She filled the heavy cast-iron kettle with snow and hung it over the flames to create steam. She raided the larder, finding the jar of dried mustard seeds and the bag of onions Elias kept for stews. She crushed the seeds in a mortar, the vibration of the pestle humming in her hand. She chopped the onions, her eyes watering from the fumes. She mixed them with flour and water to make a thick, pungent paste. She knelt beside him. Elias was thrashing, fighting invisible demons. He struck out with a fist, his knuckles grazing her cheek. Ada didn't flinch. She caught his wrist. She couldn't hold him down with strength, so she used weight. She pressed his arm to the floor, leaning her body over his chest. She looked into his wild, unseeing eyes. She took his other hand and placed it on her throat. She hummed, a low, steady resonance. It was a trick her mother had taught her a way to soothe a frightened animal. Elias froze. He felt the vibration against his palm. It anchored him. His eyes cleared for a second, focusing on her face. Ada seized the moment. She unbuttoned his shirt, exposing his chest. It was a landscape of scars and muscle, heaving with the effort to breathe. She spread the mustard poultice over a cloth and laid it on his chest. The heat of the mustard met the heat of the fever. Elias groaned. She felt the rumble in his chest wall, but he didn't pull it off. For 3 days and 3 nights Ada didn't sleep. She became his breath. Since she couldn't hear the rattle in his lungs to know if he was improving or drowning, she had to feel it. Every hour, she would crawl onto the furs beside him. She would place her hands flat on his naked chest, splaying her fingers wide to cover his ribs. She closed her eyes and listened with her skin. She felt the catch in his inhale. She felt the fluid rattling deep in the bronchial tubes, a wet, grinding vibration that terrified her. She felt the frantic, galloping rhythm of his heart. When the rattling grew too strong, she would prop him up, using her own small body as a backrest, forcing him to drink willow bark tea. When he burned up, she washed him with snowmelt, her cool hands tracing the lines of his fevered brow. He talked in his delirium. She saw his lips moving frantically, shouting names she didn't know, pleading with ghosts she couldn't see. "Sarah, Lily, don't go." She couldn't offer him words, so she offered him presence. She held his hand. She stroked his hair. She kept the fire fed. On the 4th morning, the vibration changed. Ada was dozing, her head resting on his stomach, her hand still on his chest. She woke with a start. The frantic bird-like flutter of his heart had slowed to a steady, powerful drumbeat. The grinding rattle in his lungs had smoothed into a deep, clear rhythm. She sat up. Elias was watching her. The fever was gone. His eyes were clear, sunken deep into their sockets and rimmed with dark circles. But they were sharp again. The slate gray was back. He didn't move. He lay perfectly still, looking at the woman who was curled against his side like a cat. He looked at the poultice on his chest. He looked at the bowl of broth keeping warm by the fire. He looked at her hands, chapped, red, and covered in soot. He realized, with a jolt that shook him harder than the fever, that he was alive. And he was alive because of the defective girl he had bought for $1. He lifted his hand. It trembled with weakness. Ada flinched instinctively, pulling back. Elias stopped. He held his hand in the air, palm open, showing her he held no weapon, showing her he held no anger. Slowly, carefully, he reached out again. He touched her face. His thumb brushed the smudge of soot on her cheekbone. His skin was rough, callous against her softness, but the touch was incredibly gentle. It was a question. a thank you, an apology. Ada leaned into his hand. Her eyes fluttered closed. A single tear leaked out, tracking through the soot. Elias dropped his hand. He tried to sit up, groaning as his stiff muscles protested. Ada helped him, sliding her arm behind his shoulders to support him. He pointed to the water bucket. Ada brought him a cup. He drank greedily, water spilling into his beard. He handed the cup back. He looked at her, really looked at her, not as a tool but as a savior. He tapped his chest right over his heart. Then he pointed to her. "Heart me." It was clumsy sign language, invented in the moment. Ada smiled. It was a small, fragile thing, but it lit up the dim cabin. She tapped her own chest, then pointed to the fire. "I kept the fire." Elias nodded. He watched her for a long time. Then he shifted, dragging himself closer to the hearth where the layer of black soot was thickest on the stones. He picked up a piece of charcoal from the fire pit. He beckoned her closer. Ada knelt beside him. Elias began to draw on the flat hearthstone. He drew a small house, not a cabin, but a house with a fence. He drew a stick figure of a man, a woman, and a small child, a girl. He tapped the child. He made a face of sorrow, eyes downcast, mouth a flat line. He drew a bed. He drew the child on the bed. He drew lines radiating from her heat, sickness. Then he drew a grave. He looked at Ada. His eyes were wet. He pointed to his ear, then to the drawing of the screaming child. He shook his head violently. He covered his ears with his hands, his face twisting in a memory of agony. The screaming, he sighed, though he didn't know the words. "I couldn't stop the screaming." He pointed to Ada. He pointed to her ears. He made a flat, smoothing motion with his hands in the air. Calm, quiet, peace. He reached out and took her hand. He placed it on his chest, right where she had monitored his fever for 3 days. "Your silence," he mouthed, careful to let her see the words, "saved me. The quiet saved me." Ada understood. He didn't want her to hear. He had lived in a world of screaming ghosts, and her silence was the only sanctuary he had found. She squeezed his hand. She took the charcoal from him. Next to the drawing of the grave, she drew a mountain. She drew a cabin. She drew a large stick figure, and a smaller one holding hands. She drew a fire between them. She pointed to the drawing, then to the floor of the cabin. "Here." Elias looked at the drawing. He looked at the fire she had kept burning. He looked at the woman who heard nothing of the world's cruelty, but felt everything of its pain. He leaned forward and pressed his forehead against hers. He closed his eyes, letting the vibration of their shared breath bridge the gap between his noise and her silence. "Us," he whispered, a vibration she felt in her very bones. "Us against the cold." "Which country are you watching this video from? Please let me know in the comments below," Gemini said. The spring thaw arrived not with warmth, but with a weeping of the earth. The silence of the winter was replaced by the relentless dripping rhythm of melting ice. The drifts that had entombed the cabin for months began to recede, revealing the black, wet granite beneath, slick and treacherous. The air grew heavy with the scent of pine sap and mud, a thick, cloying perfume that stuck to the back of the throat. Elias sat on the porch, whittling a piece of cedar. His movements were slow, rhythmic, but his eyes were fixed on the tree line. Beside him, a massive gray wolf dog, a stray he had found starving 2 winters ago and named Shadow, lay with his head on his paws, ears twitching at sounds too faint for human ears. Inside, Ada was churning butter. The thump splash of the dasher was a vibration she felt in her wrists, a steady heartbeat that grounded her. She paused to wipe sweat from her brow, looking out the open door at the back of Elias's head. His hair had grown long over the winter, tied back with a leather thong. He looked like part of the landscape, as immovable as the iron tooth itself. Then Shadow stood up. The dog didn't bark. He emitted a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the porch planks. His hackles rose, a ridge of stiff gray fur standing straight up along his spine. Elias stopped whittling. He didn't turn his head. He set the knife down. He reached for the Winchester leaning against the wall. Ada felt the change. The vibration in the floorboards shifted. It wasn't the rhythmic thump of the churn anymore. It was a chaotic, trembling disturbance that grew stronger with every second. She walked to the door. She saw Elias standing now, his body tense as a bowstring. She looked past him, down the winding trail that led to the valley. Riders! 4 of them. They emerged from the mist of the melting snow like specters. Their horses slogged through the heavy slush, mud flying from their hooves. Leading them was a man in a new coat, but the same stained hat, Jebediah Crouch. He looked different. The fear Ada had seen at the auction was gone, replaced by a gin-soaked arrogance. He rode a chestnut mare that looked ill-treated, foaming at the mouth. Behind him were 3 men. Ada didn't know hard-faced men with dusters covering their holsters, the kind of men who sold their morals for a bottle of whiskey and a silver coin. Elias stepped off the porch. He didn't raise the rifle. He held it loosely in one hand, the barrel pointed at the ground. He walked to the center of the clearing, placing himself between the riders and the cabin, between the riders and Ada. Crouch pulled his horse to a halt 10 yards away. He was grinning, his yellow teeth flashing in the gray light. He shouted something. Ada couldn't hear it, but she saw his head thrown back, his throat working. "Morning, Ghost," Crouch bellowed, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Thaw's here, and so is the law." Elias didn't speak. He just watched. Crouch dismounted, his boots sinking into the mud. He waved a piece of paper in the air. "You thought you stole her for $1, didn't you? Well, joke's on you, mountain man. Found a deed in her daddy's old trunk. Turns out the mute's sitting on a copper vein back in the valley. That makes her property of value." He pointed a shaking finger at the cabin. "The sale is void. I'm here to reclaim my assets, and I brought some friends to make sure the transaction goes smooth." Elias shifted his weight. "Get off my land," he rumbled. It was a low sound, like rocks grinding together deep underground. "Not without the girl," Crouch screamed, his face turning red. "She's mine. Her silence is mine. Her land is mine." He nodded to the man on his right, a scar-faced gunman with a double-barreled shotgun. The man raised the weapon. He didn't aim at Elias. He aimed at Shadow. Boom! The blast shattered the morning peace. Ada felt the shockwave hit her chest. She saw the flash of fire from the barrel. Shadow didn't even yelp. The buckshot caught him in the chest, lifting the massive dog off his feet and throwing him backward into the slush. He landed in a heap of gray fur and red blood, twitching once before going still. The world seemed to stop. Ada screamed. It was a sound she couldn't hear, but she felt it tear her throat raw. She ran onto the porch, her eyes locked on the lifeless body of the only creature besides Elias who had ever shown her kindness. Elias didn't look at the dog. He looked at the gunman. Something in Elias's face broke. The human mask fell away. The slate-gray eyes turned black. The tension in his shoulders wasn't fear. It was the coiling of a spring that had been wound too tight for too long. "Mistake," Elias whispered. He moved. He didn't raise the rifle. He threw it. The heavy Winchester spun through the air like a javelin. The stock slammed into the face of the gunman who had shot the dog. There was a sickening crunch of breaking bone. The man flew backward off his horse, unconscious before he hit the mud. The other 2 gunmen panicked. Their horses reared, terrified by the sudden violence. "Shoot him!" Crouch shrieked, scrambling backward toward the trees. "Kill the freak!" Elias didn't give them time to aim. He drew the tomahawk from his belt, a wicked piece of iron he used for splitting kindling. He charged. He didn't run like a man, he ran like a wolf, low to the ground, using the terrain. He ducked under the first wild shot zing that took a chunk out of the porch railing near Ada. He reached the second horse. He grabbed the rider by the duster and yanked. The man came down into the mud. Elias didn't stop. He brought the tomahawk down. Thud. It wasn't a clean sound. It was wet, final. The third gunman, seeing his companions fall, wheeled his horse around. He tried to run. Elias pulled his bowie knife. He didn't throw it. He vaulted over the neck of the panicked horse of the dead gunman. He landed on the fleeing rider's back. They went down together in a tangle of limbs and mud. The gunman tried to bring his pistol to bear, but Elias was a force of nature. He grabbed the man's wrist and twisted. Snap! The gun fell. Elias finished it with a knife, efficient, brutal, silent. It was over in 30 seconds. 3 men lay dead or dying in the melting snow. The mud was streaked with crimson. The horses had bolted into the tree line. Only Crouch remained. He was running. He was stumbling through the deep wet snow toward the edge of the clearing, trying to reach the dense forest. He was weeping. His arrogance dissolved into pure animal terror. Elias stood up. He was covered in mud and blood. He wiped the knife on his trousers. He picked up the tomahawk. He didn't run. He walked. He walked with the terrifying, inevitable pace of a glacier. Ada stood on the porch, her hands pressed over her mouth. She saw the carnage. She saw the man she loved transformed into a slaughterhouse. She couldn't hear the wet sounds of the dying, but she felt the vibration of death in the air. It hummed in the wood of the cabin. She watched Elias follow Crouch into the trees. She saw them disappear into the shadows. Crouch scrambled over a fallen log, tearing his fine coat. He looked back. The ghost was there, 10 paces behind, just walking. "Please," Crouch screamed, his voice cracking. "I'll give you the deed. I'll give you the money. I'll leave. I swear." Elias didn't answer. He just kept coming. Crouch tripped. He fell face first into a patch of thorny brambles. He rolled over, holding his hands up, sobbing. "Don't! I'm a businessman. You can't just kill me. There are laws." Elias stepped over the log. He loomed over the smaller man, blocking out the sun. His shadow fell across Crouch's face like a shroud. "You came to my home," Elias said. His voice was calm, conversational. "You shot my dog. You tried to take my peace." "I was just doing business," Crouch wailed. "She's deaf. She doesn't matter. She can't even hear you." Elias paused. He looked back toward the cabin, through the trees. He could see Ada standing on the porch, a small pale figure in a world of red and gray. He looked back at Crouch. He knelt down, getting close. Crouch whimpered, trying to scramble backward, but he was backed against a rock. "You're right," Elias whispered. "She can't hear me." He raised the tomahawk. Crouch opened his mouth to scream. It was a high, piercing sound, a desperate plea to a universe that had stopped listening. Elias leaned in, his eyes cold and dead as the winter ice. "And she can't hear you scream," Elias growled. The tomahawk came down. The scream cut off instantly. The silence rushed back into the forest, heavy and absolute. The birds didn't sing. The wind didn't blow. There was only the sound of Elias's breathing, heavy and ragged, and the slow, steady drip of the thaw resuming its work, washing the blood into the earth. Elias stood there for a long time, staring at the ground. Then he turned. He walked back toward the clearing, toward the woman who stood watching him from the porch, her silence the only judgment that mattered. He walked back to bury his friend and to wash the blood from his hands before he dared to touch her again. The silence that followed the violence was heavier than the snow that still clung to the north face of the mountain. It was a vacuum, rushing in to fill the space where the gunshots and screams had been, sucking the air from the valley floor until the only sensation left was the rhythmic thumping of Ada's own heart against her ribs. Elias walked back into the clearing. He moved with a slow, disjointed gait, the adrenaline draining from his system and leaving behind the leaden weight of what he had done. He was a ruin of a man, mud-spattered, blood-soaked, his chest heaving as he gulped down the thin, cold air. He didn't look at Ada. He couldn't. He walked past the porch, past the sanctuary of the cabin, and knelt in the slush beside the body of the gray wolf dog. Ada watched him. She felt the vibration of his knees hitting the wet earth through the porch planks. It was a sound of surrender. She stepped off the porch. The mud sucked at her boots, cold and indifferent. She walked to him. Elias was weeping. It was a silent, terrible grief. His massive shoulders shook, and his head was bowed over the wet fur of his only friend. He stroked Shadow's head, his large blood-stained hands trembling as he smoothed the ears back, as if trying to comfort a creature that could no longer feel pain. Ada knelt beside him. The snow was red here, a stark, violent contrast to the melting white. She didn't reach for Elias. Instead, she reached for Shadow. She placed her hand on the dog's flank. It was still warm, but the vibration of life, the steady thrum of the heart she had felt so many times while sitting on the porch, was gone. Elias looked up at her then. His eyes were red-rimmed, swimming with a mixture of sorrow and a terrifying shame. He looked at his hands, coated in the blood of the men he had butchered, and then at her clean, pale skin. He pulled back, flinching as if his touch would rot her. He stood up abruptly. He grabbed a shovel from the side of the cabin. The burial was brutal work. The ground was half frozen, a stubborn mix of rock and ice that resisted the blade. Elias attacked the earth with the same ferocity he had used on the men, driving the shovel in, tearing the soil open, sweating despite the chill. Ada found a smaller spade. She joined him. Elias tried to stop her, waving her away, signing no, heavy. Go inside. Ada ignored him. She dug. She threw the heavy, wet clods of dirt aside. She worked until her palms blistered and her back screamed, matching his rhythm. Dig, toss, dig, toss. They worked in tandem, a silent machine of grief, carving a resting place for the innocent in a world that had been unkind to them both. When the hole was deep enough, Elias lifted Shadow. He held the animal against his chest for a long moment, burying his face in the fur one last time, before lowering him gently into the earth. They filled the grave. Elias placed a heavy river stone at the head, his hand lingering on the cold rock. The other bodies crouched, and his hired guns received no such care. Elias dragged them away, roping their ankles and hauling them deep into a ravine where the carrion birds circled. He didn't bury them. The mountain would consume them. They were meat, nothing more. When he returned to the cabin, the sun was beginning to dip behind the iron tooth, casting long, bruised shadows across the snow. Elias stopped at the horse trough. He broke the thin layer of ice with his fist. He scrubbed his arms, the water turning pink and murky. He scrubbed until his skin was raw and red, trying to wash away the memory of the tomahawk, the feeling of the bone snapping under his fist. He walked inside. Ada had water boiling on the stove. She had laid out clean bandages and a jar of salve. Elias stood by the door, dripping wet, shivering. He looked at the room, the fire, the carved spoons, the drying herbs. It was a home, and he had turned it into a slaughterhouse. He saw the pack. It was an old canvas duffel he used for trading trips. He grabbed it. He began to shove items into it, a bag of dried venison, a blanket, a small pouch of coins he kept hidden in a tin, his spare knife. He turned to Ada. He was frantic, his eyes wide and wild. He shoved the bag toward her, Go, he sighed, the motion sharp and angry. He pointed to the door. He pointed down the valley, toward the town, toward the railhead, toward anywhere that wasn't here. Ada stared at the bag. She looked at him. Elias grabbed her shoulders. He shook her gently, desperate to make her understand. He pointed to himself. He made a slashing motion across his throat. He mimed the tomahawk falling. He pointed to the blood that still stained his shirt. Bad, he mouthed, exaggerating the word. Death. I am death. He pointed to her. He made the sign for light. Then he pointed to the door again. Leave. Safe. He was sending her away. He thought he was saving her. He thought the violence he had unleashed proved that he was a monster, unfit to stand in the light she brought. He was terrified that the next time the violence came, it would touch her. Ada looked at his hands, the hands that had shaken her, the hands that were trying to push her away. She reached out and took the bag. Elias slumped, a look of shattering relief and heartbreak crossing his face. He turned away, unable to watch her leave. He braced his hands on the mantel, staring into the fire, waiting for the vibration of the door closing, the sound of his heart breaking. He felt a vibration, but it wasn't the door. It was the thud of the bag hitting the floor. Elias turned. Ada hadn't left. She had dropped the bag. She was standing there, her chin raised, her eyes blazing with a fierce, silent defiance. She walked up to him. She stepped into his space, forcing him to look down at her. She took his right hand, the hand that had swung the tomahawk. She turned it over, tracing the calluses, the scars, the fresh knuckles bruised from the fight. She brought his hand to her lips. She kissed the palm. Elias froze. His breath hitched in his chest. Ada didn't stop. She took his hand and placed it on her own throat. She held it there, letting him feel the vibration of her breath, the hum of her life. She looked into his eyes. She moved her lips slowly, ensuring he could read every syllable. "You," she whispered. The sound was unformed, raspy from disuse, but distinct. She moved his hand from her throat to his own chest, right over his heart, which was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Voice. She pressed his hand hard against his heart. Speak for me. Elias stared at her. The world tilted. She wasn't afraid of the violence. She understood it. She understood that the tomahawk hadn't been an act of hate. It had been an act of love. He had silenced the world so she could be safe. Ada wasn't done. She turned to the mantel. She picked up the skinning knife, the very one she had sharpened on her first night. Elias tensed, ready to stop her, but she moved with purpose. She carved into the wood of the mantel, right above the hearthstone. The wood curled away in thin strips. She carved Ada. Then beside it she carved Elias. She didn't put a space between them. She carved a circle around both names, binding them together in the wood, scarring the cabin just as they were scarred. She dropped the knife. She turned back to him. She pointed to the names, then to the floor. Stay, she sighed. It was the first sign she had learned from him. Elias looked at the names. He looked at the woman who stood before him, small and fragile, and stronger than the mountain itself. She had seen the beast in him, the killer, the ghost, and she hadn't run. She had unpacked her bag. The dam broke. Elias fell to his knees. He wrapped his arms around her waist, burying his face in her stomach. He wept, but this time, it wasn't the silent weeping of the grave. It was a release, a surrender. He held her, as if she were the only solid thing in a spinning universe. Ada stroked his hair. She hummed that low, resonant vibration that cut through the silence. She held him while he shook, anchoring him to the earth, claiming the ghost as her own. Epilogue 5 years later. The high meadow of the Iron Tooth was in full bloom. Fireweed, An Indian paintbrush painted the slopes in riots of purple and red. The snow was a distant memory, clinging only to the highest crags. The cabin had changed. A new room had been added to the west side, built of golden pine that smelled of resin and sunlight. A porch wrapped around the front, wide and sturdy, with a rocking chair that moved in the breeze. Elias Thorne sat on the steps. His beard was trimmed, streaked with gray now, but his eyes were clear. He was repairing a fishing net, his large hands moving with a patience that had replaced the frantic energy of his youth. The door opened. Ada stepped out. She was older, the lines around her eyes deepened by sun and laughter. She carried a basket of wild strawberries, her fingers stained red with the juice. She tapped Elias on the shoulder. He looked up, smiling a true smile that reached his eyes. She pointed to the meadow. A child was running through the tall grass. A boy, perhaps 4 years old, with hair as black as a raven's wing and energy that seemed boundless. He was chasing a butterfly, tumbling over his own feet, getting back up with a joyous shout that echoed off the canyon walls. "Papa! Papa, look!" The boy shouted the words. He was loud, he was boisterous, he filled the valley with noise. Elias watched him. He felt the vibration of the boy's feet on the earth. He looked at Ada. She was watching the boy too, her expression one of profound, silent peace. She couldn't hear his shouts. She couldn't hear the wind in the trees, but she saw the joy on his face. She felt the warmth of the sun. She felt the safety of the home they had built on the bones of the past. Elias reached out and took her hand. He squeezed it 3 times. "I love you." Ada squeezed back. "I love you." She sat beside him on the step, leaning her head on his shoulder. They watched their son run in the sunlight, a testament to the life that had bloomed from the silence. The ghosts were gone. The screaming had stopped. And in the quiet of the mountain, they had found a sound sweeter than any music, the beating of 2 hearts that had learned to speak the same language.